In the dry, sweeping plains of the American Midwest, far from the noise and grind of the cities, lived Richard Sands, an American man in his early 50s. His life, spent working in the finance department of a mid-sized but thriving company, had been shaped by the echoes of a failed marriage and a string of personal ups and downs. One day, after closing a long chapter in his career, Richard felt an unshakable urge. It wasn't a crisis, not really, more a gnawing sense that if he didn't explore the world now, he might never get the chance. With no close family ties and a lifelong itch to venture beyond the familiar bounds of his homeland, Richard made a bold decision. Fresh from divorce and nursing a heart still tangled in unresolved feelings, he finally acted. At 50, he packed his bags and set off on a journey without a clear ending. At first, he considered Southeast Asia or parts of Europe, but then a scene from a documentary flashed back into his mind. Endless grasslands, wind-blown steppes, and ancient nomadic traditions. Mongolia, that vast land, had somehow embedded itself in his thoughts, and the dream of standing beneath its wide skies became irresistible. A friend warned him. Beyond the cities, Mongolia could be unforgiving. Endless prairies, deserts, and rough terrain could break even the seasoned traveler. But the more he heard, the more intrigued he became. By chance, Richard had come across a translator in an online forum, someone who told him about small, isolated tribes living in Mongolia's western regions, completely cut off from modern life. That conversation sealed it. Landing in Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia's capital, Richard began a slow westward trek. He rented a rugged vehicle, practiced some basic Mongolian with a pocket dictionary, and stayed in touch with the translator from back home. He knew English wouldn't help him much out there, but trusted he'd find a way to communicate. After spending several days in Ulaanbaatar and the neighboring towns, Richard steered into more remote terrain. As he left the last traces of city life behind, roads turned into dirt tracks, and eventually, even his phone's signal vanished. Oddly, he felt more peace than panic. It was as though the pressures of his past, his job, his divorce, the stares of neighbors, were being swept away by the wind. Now it was just him and the land. After hours of jolting across dusty paths, a barren landscape unfurled before him. Fierce winds howled, kicking up spirals of sand, and the horizon stretched on with nothing in sight, except, far off, the faint ridges of something that might be human. He had stocked up on food, water, and fuel, but he didn't know when or where he'd next encounter civilization. A slight unease crept in. What if he got stranded here? Still, he'd known the risks. He'd read about wolves, feral dogs, unpredictable weather, even the possibility of getting lost for days. Nothing about this would be easy. Back in the car, he unfolded his map and tried to spot a familiar landmark. But the wild terrain made everything look the same. No towns, no markers, just hills, wind, and dust. With no better option, he followed his instincts and pressed on. Later that afternoon, after driving another half-day, Richard noticed small dark dots on the horizon. As they came into view, he realized they were structures, maybe tents or huts. He grabbed his binoculars and spotted a handful of round, white dwellings. A nomadic settlement. Exhausted from the sun and the long drive, a wave of relief hit him. If those were traditional yurts, there would be people, water, maybe even a place to sleep. As he drew closer, he counted 8 yurts, scattered across the grasslands. Goats and sheep grazed lazily nearby. A few curious faces turned to watch as he approached. Richard parked the vehicle, climbed out slowly, and gave an awkward greeting in broken Mongolian. Just in case, he tried Spanish too, though he knew it was hopeless. The villagers didn't understand his words, but their eyes didn't show hostility, just surprise. Soon, a few of them motioned for him to come closer. That night, through halting phrases and gestures, Richard explained he was American, traveling alone. The villagers were astonished, but kind. They offered him roasted lamb and a strong, milky tea made from mare's milk. Grateful and humbled, he gave them some candy he'd brought from home and a few keepsakes as small tokens of thanks. The tribe was called the Yalan, a quiet, tight-knit group that had lived in these parts for generations. He couldn't grasp all the details they shared, but with a blend of basic Mongolian, improvised signs, and a few English words, he pieced together a rough understanding. There weren't many young men in the village. Most were women, older men, and children. That night, lying under the circular roof of a yurt, Richard couldn't help but wonder. Where were the young men? Had they left for the cities? Was there something else? He let the question drift away. His plan was simple: stay a day or two, then continue his journey westward. The next morning, the villagers invited him to see the settlement. He declined politely. They pointed to the well and the grazing lands, silently offering a look at their way of life. Then, standing in front of one of the yurts, he saw them, 3 young women. They looked to be in their early 20s, far younger than him. Each bore a quiet, captivating strength. They resembled each other slightly, yet each carried a unique kind of beauty. One of them had thick, jet-black hair tied back tightly. The first sister stood tall with a quiet grace, her presence commanding yet calm. The second, with light brown hair and a dazzling smile, radiated energy and warmth. The third wore her dark hair in tidy braids, and though she said little, her eyes lingered on Richard with thoughtful curiosity. Later, he learned their names: Jalgala, Ayun, and Naren. The village matron had clearly been introducing them to him. When Richard greeted them, the sisters returned his smile, their faces lit with interest and amusement. To his surprise, Ayun responded with a cheerful hello in Spanish. Startled and delighted, Richard answered, "Hello, nice to meet you," which drew a ripple of laughter from all 3. Clearly, they didn't understand much Spanish, but the effort to connect was enough. And just like that, a line of communication opened. Jalgala barely spoke a word of Spanish, making conversation challenging. But Ayun, having briefly visited a nearby city during her childhood, had picked up a few phrases. She stepped in as the bridge between their worlds. Naren, the quietest of the 3, rarely spoke, but her eyes held a gaze that lingered on Richard like a puzzle yet unsolved. That afternoon, the sisters invited Richard to walk with them through the pastures. Together, they watched villagers herding livestock under the wide Mongolian sky. Ayun explained their life in simple Spanish, how few young men remained in the tribe, how most had left for cities in search of work. Slowly, she began to share deeper stories, rituals, heritage, and traditions passed down through the generations. Richard, intrigued, asked how people married or raised families in a village with so few men. Ayun smiled softly and hesitated. Then, with a shy laugh, she said, "Our tribe has a special tradition. Sometimes, we welcome men from outside to help continue our family lines." Jalgala leaned in and whispered something in Mongolian. Then she looked up at Richard with a shy smile that sent a strange shiver down his spine. There it was again, that quiet, cultural custom of inviting outsiders to father children. And here he was, one lone man among 3 unmarried sisters in a village with barely any young men. For a brief moment, Richard let his imagination wander. Was it possible they might expect him to contribute? He shook the thought off. Surely not. Maybe they were teasing. Or maybe it was just folklore. That couldn't be what was actually happening. Originally, Richard had planned to stay just a night or 2 before heading further west. But the villagers' hospitality was magnetic. He also wanted to gather more stories, and Ayun's help with translation made things easier. Besides, he needed to check the vehicle and restock supplies. The weather here was unpredictable. Pausing for a while seemed wise. And so, days turned into nearly a week. During that time, Richard grew closer to the sisters. None of them were married, and they were clearly the most eligible women left in the tribe. Jalgala, the eldest, was responsible and steady, managing livestock and household tasks with admirable focus. Ayun, ever curious, constantly asked Richard about life in America. She was fascinated by his stories and photos. Naren, though mostly quiet, would often gesture for Ayun to translate her questions, always with a soft voice and endearing charm. Every day, the sisters invited Richard to sit with them, walk with them, or visit their yurt. They showed him how to saddle a goat, cook traditional meals, and even build fires in the harsh winds. He watched them with a quiet awe. Jalgala, in particular, left an impression. The way she moved with calm purpose made him feel strangely at ease. One evening, during an informal gathering, several village women and elders sat around Richard, bursting into laughter as they spoke. He didn't understand a word but felt their eyes on him. Then Ayun, standing beside him, turned with a sly smile. "Foreign men are valuable here," she said, "especially because we have no young men left. The villagers think you're very special." Richard chuckled awkwardly, unsure of what to say. But then Ayun added more bluntly, "If you allow, we can have a special ceremony. And have children." The words hit him like a gust of cold wind. His heart sank, not out of fear, but confusion. Was this real? A ceremony? Children? Was it just tradition? Or were they seriously asking him to become part of this tribe in the most permanent way? He didn't know what to think. A few days later, the sisters invited him into their yurt for the evening. Until then, he'd been staying with a middle-aged couple nearby. But now, the three young women wanted to talk at length alone. That night, Jalgala prepared a special stew. The stew Jalgala served that night was rich and earthy, full of lamb and vegetables, ingredients hard to come by in the cities. It warmed Richard in a way that had little to do with the fire and everything to do with how carefully it had been made. After dinner, he sat with the three sisters, sipping tea inside the softly lit yurt. The glow from the oil lamp flickered against the felt walls as conversation slowly grew deeper. Ayun took the lead in translating, her voice calm and deliberate. Jalgala looked at Richard intently, then slowly began to speak. Ayun translated her words with careful reverence. "Our village," she said, "has a very old family tradition. Because of the severe lack of men, when an outsider comes, he is welcomed with kindness. If he agrees, he may form a relationship with more than one woman, sometimes two sisters, sometimes three. They may have children with him. He may choose to stay or to leave. Either way, the children belong to the mothers and to the village. The man has no obligation, but if he stays because he wants to, the bond becomes stronger." Richard sat frozen, barely able to process what he'd just heard. "Is this real?" he asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. He'd heard rumors, stories about strange customs in the world's remote corners. But to sit here, inside one of them, and be a part of it, it felt surreal. Jalgala gently added, "We're three sisters. We each live alone. With no young men, it's hard to carry on our families. We know this would be a lot to ask. But if we could have children together, it would mean so much." The air grew still. The proposal wasn't just unusual. It was bold, stunning. Not one, but all three sisters were asking him to consider fathering their children. Richard's cheeks flushed with heat. "I'm over 50, he thought to himself. In America, this would be unthinkable. What would it mean to even try? What would responsibility look like in a world so far removed from my own? Sensing his uncertainty, Ayun smiled gently and said, "You're free to choose. We're not forcing anything. You can live here with us or you can leave. This is simply our way." Richard had guessed something like this might come up, but hearing it out loud left him stunned. All three sisters looked at him, their expressions shy but hopeful. Naren, the quiet one, lowered her head, her ears tinged pink. Each of them was unique, yet they shared the same quiet strength. This wasn't a trap. This was their truth, a life they had built together, and now a choice they were offering him. He thought of the harsh winters in these lands, when temperatures fell far below zero, of the brutal summers and sudden sandstorms. Life here was raw and unforgiving, but the nomads had survived it for centuries, hand in hand. Perhaps he could too. He imagined what life might become with Jalgala, Ayun, and Naren by his side. Children, a shared yurt, endless grasslands and sky. There would be hardships, yes. Children could fall ill. Livestock might die. Storms could destroy their home. But there would also be joy, love, community, and something else, purpose. Now, the sound of a newborn's cries echoed inside the yurt. The sisters moved instinctively, tending to the babies with tender, practiced care. Richard stood up to help when Ayun playfully said, "I'll hold mine tonight. You go comfort Naren's baby." Jalgala added, "I'll get the food ready." The scene was hectic, even a little messy, but it was warm. It was a family, a kind of family Richard had never known before. This life was nothing like what he'd left behind in America. It didn't follow the rules he'd grown up with, but it was real, grounded in love, and stitched together by shared care, sincerity, and quiet devotion. Life went on in the heart of the Mongolian steppes. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the night sky spilled stars over the vast emptiness. In one small yurt, lit by a single lamp, sat a man in his 50s, once broken, once lost, now surrounded by a new kind of home. There were 3 sisters who loved him, 3 children who had just arrived in this world. A family that, at first glance, looked unusual, but had become something deeply precious. The future remained uncertain. There would be more stories, more crossroads. But Richard now understood something he never had before. You only get one life. And if love and unity can be found in any form, if they can grow in even the most unexpected place, then that alone makes life worth living. His meeting with the 3 sisters had brought him the freedom he'd searched for his entire life, and a whole new form of responsibility. That was enough to change everything. What began as a strange, unconventional encounter had sparked new life deep in Mongolia's heartland. The sisters carried on their family's legacy. The villagers welcomed the change, blessing Richard as one of their own. And in time he grew roots, real roots, beneath the endless skies. Maybe one day he'd take the children back to America. Maybe people there would stare and say, "That's impossible. 1 man, 3 sisters, and kids." But isn't life always an unpredictable adventure? As the stars shimmered over the wide-open steppe, the yurt overflowed with laughter and warmth, and the love of a family forged not by rules, but by choice. Thank you for watching.